Let me set you a scene. You're 29 years old, and you and your best mate Wally have been prisoners of war for the past 22 months. Yet miraculously, you escape, and now you've been running from the Germans for the past 6 hours, and most of your mates have been shot. This is not Hollywood, or fiction of any kind. This is the harsh reality many Kiwis faced in the Second World War. However, this is merely a small verse in the story, which is Archie Campbell's life. I am proud to call this extraordinary man my great-grandfather, and it's important to note I only ever referred to him as Archie. And this stubborn bugger was one of the most influential figures in the formation of my own character. Archie started out life on the 13th of January 1914, in the small king country town of Tiaroha, in which his name Aro stems from, along with his twin sister. Archie was the result of Gisborne's local undertaker and builder finding himself getting a little bit too frisky with a housemaid. The social climate of the 1910s found the undertaker in an awkward position when this young mistress of his was discovered to be pregnant. He thought it better to ship her off to Tiaroha when news of his bastards would never escape. This was a decision that would age like a fine milk, as the stories of these twins would span another 75 years and gain international recognition. Archie's sister Iris was officially adopted by a well-off Christchurch family. Archie, however, was less fortunate and was adopted to a Wellingtonian family without any paperwork. Both of these children had been led to believe that the other had died at birth, but by slim chance, later in Iris's life, she too happened to have twins, and thought it a good idea to see if her brother's paperwork was there. The paperwork for her brother's death was non-existent, meaning one thing. Aro was still alive. But where was he? This was a question which had Iris searching all throughout rural New Zealand. It was made an awful lot harder, as young Aro had took on his foster family's last name, of Campbell, and the first name of Archie in early adulthood, as it seemed like a good idea at the time. Many of you simply couldn't imagine the impossibility of the task ahead of Iris. We need to remember this was a time without Facebook or Instagram, and electricity wasn't in some rural areas until well after the Second World War. The term finding a needle in a haystack is almost an understatement, as Iris was searching for a supposed dead man who had changed both his first and last name. It was more like the world's most challenging game of Where's Wally. However, we will talk about the resolution of this section of the story later on. The family young Aro had been fostered into was an interesting one. Pop, or Archibald Campbell, was the man of the house, and whose profession lay in building. His wife Mildred was a lady who'd been previously married twice, but had finally found her companion in Pop. Aro would grow up with 3 siblings, Roy and Ian, who were both older than Aro, and then a younger sister named Faye. Little of Archie's childhood was spent in Wellington, due to the fact that Campbell's moved to the bustling metropolitan of Oawhonga, a small logging town 50 or so kilometres southwest of Lake Taupo. There was no electricity in the township, and that wasn't to come for another 30 years in 1952, so any sort of movement at night was accompanied by oil-powered lamps. Cooking was done on wood-burning stoves, and the only way to get hot water was from reservoirs built into the stove. This water was ladled into the sink to do the dishes, or into small tin baths for your bi-weekly bath. I personally can only imagine the stink coming from the average Kiwi, as I struggle to remain stink-free even with bi-daily showers and antiperspirant. The Campbells moved into a small cottage behind an old shop that was owned and ran by a German lady called Mrs. Sigelkow. Mrs. Sigelkow soon specified that she would need some help milking the cows, so not long after they arrived, 6-year-old Aro was being woken up at 5 in the morning to milk the cows by hand. After he had finished that, he would then deliver the milk to all the appropriate houses barefoot. This morning routine was concluded with school, where you learnt, as Arch put it, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Aro's fostered father, Pop Campbell, was a large man. a frightening sight to those who didn't know him. A man with a nature as gentle as a lamb. A man who had been worshipped by his battalion mates of the Great War, which had finished early in Ara's childhood. Arch, in later life, had reserved only fond memories of the only father he ever knew. However, Pop's wife Mildred was a puzzling woman who was idolized by Pop. Mildred had a special dislike for Haro. Perhaps it was her way of reminding him that he wasn't hers. This dislike showed itself in the constant blaming of Haro whenever small mishaps had occurred around the home, and making him do all the chores. Haro's childhood had little creature comforts, and he went without a blanket or a favourite teddy bear to share the joys and the terrors of the world with. But it's important to note that he was always adequately fed and clothed. To Haro, Mildred was a terrible woman, who lied about all sorts of trivial things, always insisting Pop gives out a hiding. Mildred singled him out for every job, whether it was feeding the hens or cutting wood. There may have been times when the milk from the cows was laced with Haro's tears, as pent-up frustration and exhaustion found itself boiling over in these early morning hours. Several times Mildred made Pop pull Haro out of his bed at 10 p.m. for a hiding, having lied about finishing his chores. Pop loved Mildred, but had little choice but to do what he was told. Haro always had the feeling that he was only following orders, and Archie remembered Pop as a brilliant man. Haro loved school. The lady teachers were very nice to him, and perhaps they filled a void where a mother should be. Haro finished school at 14. He was one of the youngest to earn his school-leaving certificate of proficiency. The Great Depression started in 1929, when Haro was 15 years old, and work was hard to come by. But 6 years later, he finally found himself a real job. Haro became a bushman, learning the art of felling ancient giants such as Toltra and Haughie. This job was no pushover. You worked from sunrise to sunset with a small lunch break and no tea breaks. These weren't to be won by the workers' unions until significantly later. The constant wet conditions meant that if you didn't roll your smokes in the morning, you would have to go without them. This was a hellish prospect to the men of the time. This was Archie's reality for the next 4 years, or until the Second World War began. The Second World War had begun, and the announcement ushered in 5.5 years of austerity, death, heroism, and general suffering, all which had been promised to be ended by the Great War. The lucky ones who came home from that war were heroes. It was now their sons' turn to answer the call to arms. Archie was no exception, and he applied to join the first echelon. This was a decision motivated by both patriotism and the desire to get the hell away from rural New Zealand. Archie started to become increasingly anxious, as his mates from the mill all started to disappear while he was stuck working. It didn't become apparent why, until one day his boss came to talk to Archie. Quote, "You're lucky, young blighter. All those chaps go in the war, and you're in a protected occupation. I saved you from that, my fella. They read my letter, and I'm pleased you're staying." End quote. To which Archie swiftly replied, quote, You thought you were doing me a favour. Shit. End quote. This period of chat was followed by an awkward silence, and the first thing Arch did when he got home from work that night was write to the War Office. He was soon accepted by the third echelon. Orwonga platform had been the most crowded it had been for over a year. Pride swelled the hearts of all. However, fear also gnawed the edges of the returned soldiers, knowing the odds of survival. Pop was there, dwarfing all others at the station, and came to say goodbye to what he believed was his son. Archie boarded the train with a cheeky grin. He was thinking of the time where he had taken some of Mildred's homemade soap and greased the tracks on the gradient into Orwonga. The train's wheels had failed to gain traction and spun. Smoke and steam roared from the engine room. Arch had been dobbed in by a local driver to his family, whereupon he received another levering. Those days were over now, and a new chapter of Archie's life had just begun. The train stopped in Huntly for fuel, and unfortunately for the engineers, the Huntly pub dispensed a brew of high potency, and most of the 24th Battalion were as pissed as chooks by the time they had arrived in Papakura. In true military fashion, a young sergeant assembled the battalion in the parade ground and ordered them to fall into three ranks. Shoulders back and hands by the side, eyes forward. Unfortunately, Archie fidgeted, and the sergeant gave him an absolute earful. Quote, "I thought I told you to stand there. Listen, buddy, I'm Sergeant Stranger, and for the next 16 weeks you'll do as you're ordered." End quote. Archie once again felt like being a stubborn bugger, and retorted, quote, "Like hell you are, you're a bloody Boy Scout." End quote. And thus began his military career. To Archie, respect was given to the older chaps, veterans of the Great War, who had earned their respect through action and not bullshit. Over the next 16 weeks, the 24th Battalion learned how to shoot and maintain their Lee Enfield Mark IV rifles, how to attach and effectively use a bayonet, and other military-style training. Volunteering in the army was never considered a brilliant idea, out of fear of the later repercussions, but one day, Arch leaped at the opportunity to drive trucks. The sergeant was impressed by Campbell's ability, and unknowingly, Arch had just stamped his mark on the desert campaign. The Empress of Japan, a converted cruise liner, greeted the troops and had its sights set on Egypt, but first stopped in Perth to pick up some bloody Aussies. The heat, the stink, and the never-ending sand was Archie's first impressions of Cairo. He made a name for himself by climbing halfway up one of the pyramids. Being a short ass, no taller than 5'8", this was a supremely impressive feat. However, he never made it to the top. There were 6 more months of training in Cairo, and sand worked its way into everything. The high temperatures were unbearable compared to the significantly cooler King Country. During his time in Egypt, Archie was a part of the formation dreamed up by Allied commanders known as the Tank Hunting Platoon. The idea being to ambush enemy tanks with bottled smoke bombs and in the resulting confusion rake them with anti-tank shells. This technique was so formidable that the platoon was commissioned to demonstrate the technique in a local amphitheatre. During one of the demonstrations in front of a group of Allied VIPs, a young sergeant happened to lift the tank's canopy the same time Archie threw a smoke. Archie's aim was impeccable, and the sergeant collapsed in the surrounding smoke. General Freiberg made his way towards Archie and extended his hand to Arch. Quote, "Great shot, sir. Couldn't have been better. We'll show 'em, won't we, soldier?" End quote. This was one of Archie's 4 meetings with the great general. All the while in the background, the driver was whisked off to hospital, never to be seen again. Orders arrived for the 3rd Echelon to go and help on the front line, between Albania and Macedonia, where the Germans were advancing. However, their first stop was Athens, and Archie's battalion was taken there on the HMS Ajax, a British destroyer. The camp in Athens was massive, with over 15,000 Allied troops, all raring for a chance to have a go at the Jerries. It was only after a short briefing they were sent off to Salonika, on the Albanian border. Upon arriving at the front line, the 24th was to defend a huge trench and stop German tanks and trucks. Each soldier was issued 5 rounds of ammunition, and all had bayonets. The world had advanced 20 years since the Great War, and they were here preparing for a battle in trench mentality. Churchill had dropped them in it. To be quite frank, the 24th Battalion was up shit creek without a paddle. They were on the run almost before the Mediterranean sun had risen, and all visions of courageous deeds seemed to disappear. They were digging in, then retreating, only a shade faster than the Germans were advancing. Archie was driving all-night shifts, with tiny slits for lights, and following the trucks ahead was, as he put it, quote, like picking out a cigarette end in the black hole of Calcutta. End quote. Archie's first bombing attack occurred when he and his company were holed up in an olive grove, while being stalked by a German reconnaissance plane. One of Archie's buds, Arthur Franklin Brown, was sick of lugging around the only anti-tank gun, and couldn't resist the urge to take a pot shot at the plane. The parting of the leaves was all the pilot required, and he dove through, hurling a couple of bombs. 3 men died. Upon regrouping on the outskirts of Athens, there were several hundred men missing in action. There was already, even at this early stage, a sense of growing resentment, as they had been under-equipped, which made them especially vulnerable. An evacuation had been planned, and the 24th was dropped off on the island of Crete, which was peaceful at the time, but would become an important battlefield in the Mediterranean war theatre. It was during the evacuation that Arch crossed with Sergeant Stranger again. Stranger was convinced in the midst of a major evacuation that Arch had nicked a can of margarine from the senior sergeant's mess and intended to share it with the boys. Stranger searched Arch's gear, and to much surprise, found the lost margarine, which was simply being borrowed. Quote, "There's a bloody war going on, and all you can think of is your margarine, you bloomin' woofer." End quote. This is the last they saw of each other. The HMS Ajax then returned to Alexandria, as she had to refuel. Upon arrival in Egypt, Archie was promoted to corporal, and the 24th would stay put for the next 6 months, or until November 1941. They were deployed south of Tobruk, in Libya, and landed themselves in the Battle of Sidi Rezegh. Much like the situation in Greece, they had been undersupplied. The only additions were a couple of Bren light machine guns. Sidi Rezegh had been a part of Operation Crusader. It was Churchill's push to clear the Axis forces out of North Africa. There were many skirmishes at Sidi Rezegh, the later ones more focused and strategic winners. Their first engagement was a battle which the 24th had little hope winning against the better equipped German troops. Out of 30 in Archie's platoon, only 7 survived. In this process of decimation, Archie was promoted to acting officer. A day after a break in the fighting, Archie's platoon was approached by a group claiming to be friendly forces. Archie was suspicious of them, due to them coming from a position where the enemy had been. The father of future Kiwi Prime Minister, David Lang, agreed, and they opened fire. In the ensuing firefight, their captain was killed, and inevitably, Arch and his group were taken prisoner. There were thousands of POWs, and they were considered the lucky ones, as there still remained a flicker of hope. They were herded into a desert camp in Benghazi, where they remained for 8 days before being put onto a ship headed towards Italy. Sailing was nerve-wracking for Archie, as he never learned how to swim, so if catastrophe were to happen, he would once again be up shit creek without a paddle. And in true war fashion, catastrophe striked. Unfortunately for Archie, no one had told the British that this was in fact a POW ship, as they were not flying the Red Cross flag, so technically the ship was fair game. Water rushed into the lower decks of the ship, and for several hours they held on for dear life, as the water continued to rise. The hatches were open, and they made their way onto the main deck with 2,000 other men, who were all scared shitless by something they had no control over. Somehow the boat made it to the Greek shoreline, which was no more than 6 miles away at the time. It was the middle of winter, and dysentery spread quickly. This was war at its lowest ebb. The locals' conditions weren't too much better, but that was the reality of this nasty war. They stayed in Greece for a month, before being moved successfully to Italy. Overall, the Italians treated the prisoners well. Neither prisoner or guard wanted to make too much fuss because both completely understood the consequences. The food wasn't very exciting either. Fennel soup most of the time, and a hunk of bread if you were lucky. The majority of time in Archie's POW experience was spent working in vineyards, clipping leaves to let the sun through to the grapes. It was when the Germans started to advance into Italy when Archie decided it was time to escape. This was a decision mainly influenced out of fear of being sent to a German Stalag. At the time, Archie was in the region of Pescara, about 200 kilometers east of Rome. Him and 16 mates took off from the camp, and about 300 others legged it in all directions. The locals were mostly friendly, and provided food and shelter. They were behind German lines, and at one point almost ran into a German battalion, which forced the boys to backtrack over a mountain, which was similar to Ruapeu. It took the boys several days of hard tramping to traverse the mountain, but they met a local boy herding goats, who guided them to a small township. The young boy went off to find the mayor, who was Archie described as a fine, upstanding chap. The mayor promised to warn them by hanging a red flag out of his window, if and when the Germans appeared. Unfortunately, he was not able to, but Archie and Wally Williams smelled a rat, and were able to take off minutes before the Germans overran the village. Ron Brown, a comrade, was captured by the Germans, and had been told that both Archie and Wally had been shot. Arch met Brownie after the war, and tried to convince him that he was in fact Haughie Campbell, but Brownie would go to his deathbed believing Archie had been shot in Pescara. Just minutes after scurrying out of the village, Arch fell badly, but got up and continued to run for another 6 hours. They later learned that the mayor was interrogated, and held out long enough for Arch and Wally to flee. All the other men were captured, and once again became prisoners of war. Wally and Arch just so happened to be running straight towards the Battle of the Sangro River. They had been POWs for the last 22 months, and it was winter again. Conditions weren't great. The roads were muddy, and it was very cold. As the two chaps bedded down for the night, the bullets and artillery screeched through the night sky not too far from where they were. Unknown to them, today was their final day of being a POW. They knew they had to get further south across the enemy lines and find the Allies as soon as possible. Wally and Arch absolutely legged it across the nearest bridge, and moments after they arrived on the southern end, the bridge exploded and collapsed into the water. A German officer had challenged them. Fortunately for them, they were still completely intact, and the two chaps continued to scamper southbound until eventually they ran into British troops. At first, the British treated them as enemy, and aggressively demanded to know who they were. It was particularly hard to convince the British troops they were Kiwis, as both Archie and Wally were dressed as Italian civilians, and looked as if they had been dragged up a rat hole backwards. Credentials were finally established, and they were directed back to what remained of the 24th Battalion. Even after all that, Archie and Wally were both prepared to sign up again, and roll the dice for the sake of their country and the free world. This was unallowed, as General Freyberg promised Prime Minister Peter Fraser that anyone taken prisoner would be sent home immediately. Archie's war was over. One would have expected a homecoming to banners and balloons, but there was a stigma attached with having been a prisoner. There was a mistaken perception that any able-bodied man shouldn't be coming home until the Nazi foe had been defeated. Almost as if it were their fault for being at home a year early. It was a tough time for Archie, as he was unable to recount his experiences until this prejudice had disappeared. To me, I would have been heartbroken if I had sacrificed everything, only to come home to a country which viewed me almost as a letdown. Civilian life treated Arch well, and he had moved up to Auckland and was boarding with a few of his mates. However, his life would be forever changed when he met Mari on the Ofonga platform. Archie soon took great fancy to this woman. Before he knew it, they were going out to the pictures, or the movies as us modern people call them, and they also frequented dance halls all over Auckland. Mari had a daughter whose father had been one of the many who weren't as fortunate to return home after the war. Archie, being a true gentleman, didn't want to push their relationship, out of respect for Mari's widowhood, but he finally popped the question in September of 44. They got married 6 months later, in March of 45. A notable absence from the wedding was Pop, who couldn't make it up to Auckland due to Mildred's death in the end of 44. Upon hearing news of Mildred's death, and I may be paraphrasing here, Arch very politely said, quote, "The world's now a better place." End quote. This comment was the result of years of pent-up frustration, and anger towards a lady as Archie described as cruel. A year after their wedding, the young lovers added 2 more additions to their family of 3, with Robin, my grandmother, being born in 46, and Phil, the youngest, being born in 49. Archie's life was relatively normal for the next 20 years. However, in 1969, the Campbells got the call from hell, when Phil, who was just 19 at the time, was involved in a serious car accident, only 250 meters away from home. The tow truck driver thought that both occupants of the vehicle were dead, but Arch knew that Phil was alive. He was, but he had a broken back and left the hospital paraplegic. It took another 20 years for maybe Archie's most famous moment to occur. A television show called Missing was aired by TVNZ, and was hosted by well-known broadcaster Brian Edwards. Iris had applied to appear and tell her story, and after some difficulty, it was apparent that Archie was the missing link which the program had been searching for. He travelled to Wellington for the second episode, and in a moment which can only be described as beautiful, Archie, after 75 years, had finally met his twin sister. Emotions flowed down the cheeks of both brother and sister. The live studio audience had gained an exclusive insight into the lives of these 2 old people. Iris also told Archie that he had another legitimate brother, who Archie had met in Libya and was killed about the same time Archie was taken prisoner near Sidi Rezeg. Meeting Iris was the antidote Archie needed, and Mari had slowly fell into the clutches of Alzheimer's, and for his own sake, he had her transferred to a nursing home. 2 years later, Mari was to die. A wonderful wife, a loving mother, and a dear friend. In 91, both Iris and Arch were sent to the University of Minnesota to take part in an epidemiological study of separated twins. The study measured comparative functional development and differences in bodily development. The university also paid for a week of accommodation wherever they wanted to go within the States. So like any old people, the set of twins decided Disneyland was where they wanted to be. An indirect consequence of being in the university studies was that in 91, Archie and Iris were entered into the Guinness Book of Records as the longest living separated twins. Archie was a hard bugger. The type of bloke who said he wouldn't be old until he was 90. Once arriving at 90, he once again refused to succumb to the reality of old age. He showed this by building a patio at the age of 91, all by himself. Archie finally succumbed to his old age in 2011, when he died 97 years young. Archie's story is one of perseverance, and personally I think it should be shared with everyone, as it teaches us that we've got it pretty easy nowadays. I think it's funny because I'm currently recording this during a global pandemic, but I guess Archie bet me to that as well, as his childhood years were spent during the Spanish flu pandemic. Archie was a humble man, whose life could only be described as a tad mental. I'm proud to say that I got to spend 8 years of my own life with him, and I'm also fortunate enough to have my family's history written down. So I leave you fellow young people a request. Go ask someone from an older generation about their story. I'm sure you'll be surprised about the tales they'll tell. Thank you for listening.